Hello, and welcome to the GC80 show. My name is Amanda Skofstad, Public Affairs Officer for the Episcopal Church. Today's guest is the Reverend Chris McNabb, Program Manager for Neighbor to Neighbor with Episcopal Migration Ministries. I had the chance to sit down virtually with Reverend Chris, he in his home office in Seattle, and I in the Episcopal Church's digital media team in our New York City studio. We talked about Neighbor to Neighbor, a program from Episcopal Migration Ministries that trains and provides ongoing support to faith communities who serve as community sponsors for asylum seekers and Afghan arrivals. We discussed how Neighbor to Neighbor came about, what it means to lean into communities of kinship, and how folks who might be interested can get involved with Neighbor to Neighbor. Let's take a look. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit an overview? How long have you been with EMM?
Yeah, so I came on board as a contractor with the Neighbor to Neighbor program about a year ago now.
Excellent. And let's get right to it. Can you tell us a little bit about Neighbor to Neighbor, this program for Episcopal Migration Ministries? How did it come about?
Absolutely. So the Reverend Christina Rathbone was a bridge chaplain serving at the U.S.-Mexico border amidst all the complexities that were happening a number of years ago, where folks were forced to wait before they could apply for asylum. And so there was this huge backlog of individuals waiting on bridges to cross into the United States. And she faithfully served the people there. And some of them were able to get their asylum claim processed and then entered the United States and settled in different parts of the country, but had no family, no safety net to help them navigate the complexities of life here in the United States. And so many of them would reach out to Christina and say, hey, I need to get my children enrolled in school, or hey, I need to learn English, or how do I get access to this particular government office? And Christina didn't know because these folks had been scattered throughout the country. And so she began imagining the possibility of a program called Neighbor to Neighbor, where we would equip local Episcopal churches to meet the needs of asylum seekers. So that began the Neighbor to Neighbor program. I came on board last summer, the summer of 2021. And then soon after my onboarding, Kabul, Afghanistan fell. And so we expanded the Neighbor to Neighbor program to also meet the needs of newly arriving Afghans. And so right now we work with asylum seekers as well as newly arriving Afghans to give them an opportunity by building those communities of kinship with local Episcopal churches and churches of all different denominations as well, to essentially be people's first friend, to be their neighbor when they first arrive here and help them navigate all the complexities of life in the United States.
Thank you for that background. And that's incredible. So this program has been built and grown really like in a little over a year's time. Is that right?
Correct.
Wow. And so, how many people roughly are involved in it? Like how many churches have signed on and have become, communities for these families as they settle into various parts of the United States?
Absolutely. So right now we have about 10 congregations that are actively sponsoring an individual. And then we have a whole host of folks who are in the discernment process and a number of other congregations that are waiting for a match. And
so, when we think about the kind of resources and work that are required for doing this, for forming such a neighbor to neighbor group, I'm curious, how is this program funded? How does that all work kind of in the real world?
Totally. It's a great question. So at this point, all of our funding comes from outside grants. UTO has provided us a grant, and then a number of other organizations, foundations outside of the Episcopal Church are the main funders of this work right now. So we would love to change that and have it funded through the Episcopal, through General Convention and Executive Council. But it's a relatively new program. I think folks are still learning about it. So that's certainly on our list, our to-do list.
Great. Thanks for that. And so tell us a little bit about what this program actually means to you personally. Like, what is it like to be involved in this work, and what for you is maybe the most meaningful aspect?
So I think right now, church, especially as we continue to navigate the COVID pandemic, I think a lot of us are sort of grasping for, well, what is church in 2022? What makes sense? Why bother continuing to show up on Sundays? Why bother continuing to be the body of Christ when there's so much that tells us it's not worth it, right? Society, the world, it can feel sometimes foolish to continue in this work of following Jesus. And I think Neighbor to Neighbor provides an antidote to that, right? It says we are in the work of building communities of kinship such that God might recognize them. Greg Boyle, the famed Jesuit priest who works with former gang members, right, often talks about that need to build those communities of kinship. And what we're doing is we're connecting average, everyday Episcopalians to folks who they may never have the opportunity to connect with in any other area or aspect of their life. And so we're able to sort of pull on the tradition and the history of Episcopal Migration Ministries. It's the years and years of faithful service of countless people, as well as sort of the creativity of a bridge chaplain and Christina Rathbone, who was committed to making this work, the church engagement unit of EMM, Canon Chuck Robertson, our director, Demetrio, all the people who said, you know what, like we believe that connecting individuals across different cultures, across from different countries, who speak different languages, who believe different things, that this is one of the ways that we can live into the Jesus movement in 2022. One story that sort of sticks with me, there's one of our Neighbor to Neighbor teams recently relocated a family from Afghanistan. And in their apartment building across the hall is a gentleman who also is from Afghanistan, who's been a taxi driver in the United States for 25 years. And he had always prayed that he would have the opportunity to help another Afghan family. And there, across the hall, right, an Afghan family moved in because of the Neighbor to Neighbor program. And that Afghan family sent their little boy to kindergarten. And on his very first day, he met another boy in his class who also was from Afghanistan, had arrived to the United States a year previous. And the two kids hit it off and became fast friends. And so I just love that the Episcopal Church was involved with connecting these two kids, these two families who may not have otherwise been connected. And because of the Neighbor to Neighbor team on the ground, because of Neighbor to Neighbor, that's possible. And so I think we're beginning to make connections in a time where we feel extremely fractured and separate from one another. Neighbor to Neighbor is about sort of being the synapses that connect us to individuals who might appear to have so little in common with us. But the more we get to know them, the more we build relationships with them, the more we see the connections.
Great. Connected to that, you said something earlier about Jesuit Father Gregory Boyle and his work, and he talks about this idea of kinship. And I wondered, as you understand it, as you think of it, I know a little bit about what that refers to, but I wonder if you might talk to our audience a little bit about maybe the difference between what kinship means and helping. There's a kind of distinction that folks discuss, especially in doing this kind of work, and what benefits are gained by leaning into kinship versus just showing up to help or something like that, or however you would frame it up.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So Greg Boyle, in his book Tattoos on the Heart, speaks frequently about the recognition that there is nothing that separates us, right? That he often quotes Mother Teresa, that we must wake up from the illusion of our separateness. And so I think when we show up and say, I want to help somebody, that puts us in a position of power. That says that here I am with something to give, and here you are needing something from me. And what Greg Boyle, in his attempt to sort of give us this language around communities of kinship, what he's really getting us towards is to acknowledge that we are the same, that what every human being desires is a place to belong, a place where they are loved and nurtured and valued and held up as important and beloved. And so if we can make that our goal, to acknowledge our shared belovedness rather than say, here I am with something to give, but rather here I'm showing up with something to learn, because my liberation and your liberation are bound up together. And that is something that we really strive for within Neighbor to Neighbor. And it's certainly something that I hope the Episcopal Church continues to strive towards.
Thank you for that. Let's say I'm out there, I'm an Episcopalian, and I'm a churchgoer, and I see all of this in the news, and I read about it in materials that come from the church, and I don't really know. I don't know where I can possibly start. People have families and jobs, and they're busy, but they have a deep sense, I think, that they'd like to become involved in this work. Like, what would that actually entail? How do you take that first step to think about getting involved with Neighbor to Neighbor?
Absolutely. So certainly you can check out the Neighbor to Neighbor page on EMM's website, fill out an initial interest form, which also will then give you an opportunity to sign up for a weekly information session. We hold them every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. And it's an opportunity to meet with me, to learn more from other congregations that are doing this work, and talk about and discern together the possibility of you sponsoring a family. Now, sometimes smaller churches, right, may have a hard time saying, listen, we only have 30 people or 20 people who show up on a Sunday, and this is a huge ask. And so we encourage you, reach out to your local diocese, reach out to other churches. We have Neighbor to Neighbor teams that are made up of Episcopal and Methodist churches together. We have UCC churches, we have Roman Catholic churches. One of our teams is 3 different Episcopal churches that formed one Neighbor to Neighbor team. So there's all sorts of ways to collaborate and get creative and think outside the box around how to respond to this work and to this invitation. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, right, funding is always an issue in the nonprofit sector, and Neighbor to Neighbor is not immune to that reality. And so if you are in a position to donate, we would love to accept that donation with generous hearts. And again, there's opportunities to donate on the EMM website specifically for the Neighbor to Neighbor program.
Wonderful. Chris, thank you so much for talking with us about this program. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here, for your time and energy today, and for the good work that you and the EMM team are doing.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be with you, and many blessings on the effort.
To find out more about Neighbor to Neighbor, visit episcopalmigrationministries.org. Special thanks to our partners at Church Pension Group and Episcopal Divinity School at Union for making this show possible. I encourage you to learn more about our sponsors in the description that accompanies this video.